We'd like to also add a disclaimer about Andrea's talk. Due to FDA legal review restrictions, content will be the same as the presentation given during the AMI 2020 webinar series with live voiceover and Q&A tailored to UnCon 2020. So I'm going to hand things over to her.
Great, thank you. Okay, so I'm Andrea. I'm a BVIS 2018 graduate, and I've been with the FDA since 2018. I'm a staff fellow at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration in the Center for Devices and Radiological Health in the Office of Science and Engineering Laboratories in the Division of Imaging, Diagnostics, and Software Reliability. So today I'll be talking about some evaluation challenges and research at the FDA regarding medical augmented and virtual reality. So this talk will be fairly academic, especially compared to some of the talks you've been hearing so far. Today we're going to cover why the FDA is interested in augmented and virtual reality and discuss various evaluation challenges, and then summarize a few of the regulatory research topics led by the Medical Extended Reality Research Team at the FDA. So first, I'm going to go over some definitions. I'll glide over them. I know most people here in this audience are aware. In virtual reality, users are immersed in a virtual environment with virtual objects, and in augmented reality, the users have a view of their physical environment, but with added virtual elements. And some head-mounted displays, such as the HP Reverb with front-facing cameras, are branded as mixed reality headsets. And these headsets can all fall under the same umbrella term, extended reality, which encompasses a spectrum from the physical environment to a purely virtual environment. So why is the FDA interested in XR? And well, it's less to do with video gaming and entertainment and more to do with medical applications. So as you are aware, advancements in AR and VR have prompted the development of many use cases in medicine, and current XR applications actively being investigated include medical training, therapy, rehabilitation, pain management, and visualization of medical data sets for diagnostics or even surgical applications. However, due to the pace of development, the evaluation of these devices significantly lags behind, and this increases the risk for ineffective or unsafe applications of AR and VR. And the mission of our office, which is the Office of Science and Engineering Laboratories, can be found on the bottom of every slide, which is accelerating patient access to innovative, safe, and effective medical devices through best in the world regulatory science. So in OSL, we have a medical extended reality, or MXR, research team doing just that. So we have team members from the Division of Imaging, Diagnostics, and Software Reliability, and we aim to characterize image quality and display performance of the head-mounted displays by examining the associated optical, hardware, and software properties. You can see one of our optical measurement setups on the bottom left. And team members from the Division of Biomedical Physics shed light on the associated human factors. So that includes motion tracking and sensor performance validation. And you can see in the center image, one of our researchers testing the virtual reality omnidirectional treadmill surrounded by motion tracking cameras. So our MXR team at the FDA, we address open research questions associated with novel MXR devices and the development and design and evaluation of them. And our outcomes provide scientific foundation and support of regulatory requirements and decisions on MXR applications. So this is why we are interested in MXR. So how do you assess performance and risk for safety or effectiveness of MXR applications? So take a look at the figure all the way on the left. Unlike medical devices that are designed and engineered for a specific task or a procedure, a single VR application can be viewed through a variety of different VR headsets, and likewise, a single VR headset can be expected to run a range of different VR applications. And note that the various types of applications listed in the center figure have different categories of risks and levels of complexity depending on the indications for use. So for example, using an XR headset for education and training applications will have less risks compared to using XR headsets for intraoperative surgery. And so these applications will be assessed in different risk categories, even though they run on the same device. Furthermore, each device and each application are not necessarily consistent in image quality, viewing conditions, or human factors. And so if you look on the right, it's an incomplete list of ongoing technical evaluation challenges for medical XR applications. And so I hope this gives you a little bit of an idea of some of the evaluation challenges that we face. And today I'm going to briefly summarize some of our research work related to the examples that I just gave. And if you see in blue, I'll be talking about transverse chromatic aberrations, inconsistent transfer of color in graphics rendering, and spatial temporal characterization. Okay, so transverse chromatic aberrations. So in general, optical design of VR headsets is complicated by the presence of by the preference of wide field of view at the expense of focal length. And so what this does is it introduces transverse chromatic aberrations, or TCA, and this is a wavelength dependent magnification across the field of view. So for example, when a user is looking at an off-axis white pixel through a VR headset, rather than the white light focusing on a single spot on the retina, as you can see on the top left, the light from the RG and the red, green, and blue subpixels are imaged to different locations on the retina. And so this results in a color-dependent blurring of the image or in spatially separated objects of different colors, and you can see that on the bottom left. So the relative position of objects will vary across of the field of view as a function of color due to the optics of the HMD. So if you look on the right, this is an image of TCA on the Oculus Rift that we captured using a camera. So we made this simple test pattern with alternating blue and red bars. And what we found was that while these bars line up, they are side by side in the center of the field of view as intended. The red and the blue bars, if you go over to the edge of the field of view, they start to overlap due to the TCA. So there's a red shift and a blue shift that occurs in opposite directions. And so this results in a perceived overlapping of these two colored bars, even though it wasn't rendered this way. Okay, so on the left is our experimental setup for measuring TCA for VR headsets, and offset in the positions of the bars relative to the expected positions from the design pattern are shown on the top right. And these results aren't so intuitive for relating to human perception. So we then converted the measurements to visual angle, as you can see on the bottom right. So a positive value for TCA indicates a shift towards the nasal visual field, and a negative value indicates a shift towards the temporal visual field. So in the example in the bottom right figure, you can see that at a visual angle of 10 degrees, you have blue light, which shifts towards the temporal visual field, and red lights that is shifting towards the nasal visual field. Okay, we can measure TCA using a camera, but can human users see it, and does it matter? So to find out, we ran a psychophysics experiment for 5 users on the Oculus Rift and measured them at different angles. We asked the users to independently shift the red and blue bars until they thought it aligned with the green bars, as indicated by the white arrows. So these results are compared to the values from the lab results, and they are in excellent agreement. So yes, human users can absolutely see the TCA, and their results from the user test match our camera results in the lab. Okay, on the top left is a heat map of eye tracking in VR, and below that is a figure of the human field of view. So does TCA actually matter? And if you look in virtual reality, users are not just looking at the center of the field of view at all times in a headset. Their eyes are moving all over the place, oftentimes more than 30 degrees from the center of the field of view. And from our test results, we found that the TCAs have a noticeable and negative impact on image quality for angles larger than 5 degrees. So on the right is an example of TCA in a digital pathology simulated in MATLAB. And so you can notice that there's blurring of fine features and rainbowing that happens along the edges at 2% and 4%. So this has implications for the interpretation of medical data, as accurate visualization of medical images across the field of view is critical for instance, diagnostic or surgical tasks. Okay, so we measured the horizontal and vertical TCA across multiple headsets, the Oculus Rift, Oculus Go, Samsung Gear, and the HTC Vive. And we found that the TCA for one headset was different in sign and as TCA in another headset. So in other words, the red and the blue shifts were happening in opposite directions depending on the headset that you were using, which is interesting. So imagine, for instance, an XR application with a blue vein and a red artery that's right next to each other. And even if the same images are rendered to a display, the relative position of the blue vein and the red artery for the viewer may be different across all of these headsets due to the different optical components of the various models. They may be either side by side or overlapping depending on what you're looking through. So considering that traditional 2D medical displays have extensive calibration processes to assure medical display quality and performance, there's still a lot to be done here in the XR space. So this work, titled Transverse Chromatic Aberration in Virtual Reality Head-Mounted Displays, was published last year in Optics Express. Feel free, you're welcome to refer to this paper for further reading if you are interested. Okay, next up on our list of research topics is the transfer of color in graphics rendering engines, which is not always consistent. So currently, the development of many medical XR applications rely on game engines such as Unity or Unreal Engine. And so, what's wrong with using a game engine for medical XR development, right? There's nothing wrong with it as long as the developers understand the engine's underlying rendering properties and how those renderers ultimately affect the medical image quality when looking at it through an XR head-mounted display. So while some game developers might understand the aspects of the 3D rendering and visualization pipeline, this often isn't the case for the medical community diving into XR development for the first time, because they may not necessarily have a background in computer graphics. And at the same time, graphics rendering capabilities of game engines aren't currently standardized in the context of medical visualizations. And so the characterization of color it's not yet consistently defined across literature. And considering that 3D visualization approaches for diagnostic imaging using radiography these require, like X-rays, they require predictable color representation and compliance to a target luminance model such as the DICOM grayscale standard display function, and true and pseudo color representations should really be utilized. So in this figure on the slide here, a digital pathology image, a digital chest radiograph, and a full field digital mammogram are input through 5 material, lighting, and camera configurations within the Unity engine in the rendering of cross-platform applications. So if you compare these rendered images with the input image, they don't necessarily exhibit predictable color representation nor compliance, and true color representation isn't necessarily utilized. So the assessment of color transfer throughout an XR system's visualization pipeline should distinguish between the hardware and the software components. In this case, that's the computer and Unity, from the display component, such as the display performance of the LCD or the OLED. And so in this study, we addressed only the driving component, which is Unity's graphics rendering engine. So we first tested 24 color patches from the color checker chart, which is currently, or it's commonly used for color calibration of cameras and other color input devices. So that's the 24 colors in the center that you see there. And so the transformation of color was investigated based on the initial RGB input values for the material color, and then we compared that with the RGB rendered output from the rendering camera in Unity. And so we have configurations here which vary in material, lighting, and camera, as I mentioned, and the configuration 1 is what is default for the camera light and material. When you open up Unity, these are the default properties. Okay, so results 1. Each of these 24 color patches were sampled as a single frame post-render PNG image, and the render results can be seen on the left. And on the right here is the analysis of color difference, which is calculated based on the CIE 1976 color difference formula, which basically is just a distance formula between the input and the output color points in a 3D space. And what you have to keep in mind here is the greater the delta E value, the greater the color difference that is perceived. So if you look at the figure on the right, excluding the unlit shader, which is configuration 5, you can see all the triangles on the bottom. Excluding that configuration, all the other ones cover a range of the CIE color space, and they all vary quite a bit from what was input through the Unity rendering pipeline. And you can also see they show a distinct pattern. So specifically, the delta E values show an increasing pattern on the grayscale ramp for patches 19 to 24. So if you look in the very bottom right, 19 to 24, and that's just pretty interesting there. If you look at configuration 1, actually the default returns the greatest delta E values or the greatest color difference. Okay, so in another experiment, we found that the texture import settings also add distortions to the pixels even when using an unlit shader. So, in the last experiment, the unlit shader returned 0 color difference, but then in this experiment where we were inputting an image, we saw some noticeable differences. So this image is called the TG18QC test pattern. It's used to assess the capability of a display. So this TG18QC test pattern was imported as a 2D texture in Unity and then rendered as an unlit texture. And so I was expecting it to be exactly the same, but you can see that there's a difference between the input and the rendered output. And if you, and so the figure on the right, I actually just took the input image and then also took in the unlit shader as 2 different layers into Photoshop. And then if you take the difference between the two, you can see this color banding effect kind of broken down in the right. So anyway, the point is here, even if you're using an unlit texture, Unity doesn't really preserve the integrity of that image quite completely. Okay, so the proposed framework addresses the characterization of rendering techniques for exploratory VR visualizations, and this research provides developers of medical XR applications with considerations regarding how to ensure color information displayed in the headset is accurate and consistent. So this work, titled Color Rendering in Medical Extended Reality Applications, was recently published in the Journal of Digital Imaging 12 days ago, actually. So by myself and my mentors, Wei Chong, Ryan, and Aldo. If you're interested in reading this paper, you can use the link on the top right to access it. Okay. So finally, let's jump into my latest research, spatial temporal effects. So like the last 2 research projects I mentioned, this one also focuses on image quality configurations, considerations for medical visualization applications in XR. So if you're considering imaging modalities such as X-rays or CTs, ultrasound and MRIs, what are some things to be considered here in terms of spatial temporal noise and resolution to preserve the integrity of medical data? So the first bullet point, the XR HMDs are subject to constant changes in the visual field, even when visualizing static data. So think about it this way, because an XR environment is at least partly digital, whether it's augmented or virtual, there's some digital element. So the rendering of medical data must be constantly updated with the user's real-time movement, and the user's head is never going to be perfectly still. So the visual field is going to constantly be changing. So that's what I mean by that. And the second point, an XR environment can be unique depending on the hardware or software. So for example, you can have the HTC Vive Pro, and then you can have the Oculus Quest, and then let's say you're using a Vario XR1, which is a $10,000 headset. These all will perform differently. And then on top of that, you can have different kinds of software applications running on one or all of these headsets. And then on top of that, the performance might be inconsistent even within one application, depending on the size of the medical file to be visualized. So if you're comparing this to traditional display presentations, which have defined calibration processes to safeguard the quality of visualization, the display performance of XR HMDs are they might be a bit more unpredictable. Okay, so the components of the XR system are illustrated as 10 distinct steps here. And this is like one of the most artsy things I've done most recently. So I'm open to feedback if you want to critique this. Okay, so we consider the XR system as a complete pipeline, starting from user movement, which is captured by the inertial measurement unit, or the IMU, and the camera sensors. And then, so that's from 1 to 2. And then the user input is sent to be processed by the device's rendering engine and graphics processing units, or GPUs. So so that's from 3 to 4 to or 3 to 6. But if you are considering, for instance, augmented reality and some of the newer VR headsets that come with spatial mapping and image registration, that's where 4 would fit in, where AI would be happening. And then these rendered images would then be sent to the display panels, which are at step 7 here. And then from then, they're perceived by the user through the optics of the head-mounted display, so 8, 9, and 10. Okay, so the response times of each of these individual components add to the overall process time of image rendering and perception. So the TCA problem that we discussed earlier, that happens just at step 8. And the color rendering problem that I was talking about just a moment ago, that's from steps 5 to 6. And next, oops. Okay, and so there's you know, this continuous loop, this feedback from 1 to 10, there's this delay between 1 and the update of 10 that happens. And this is known as motion to photon latency, or end-to-end latency. And this latency is known to cause nausea amongst many other problems. So some headsets actually implement motion prediction, but not all prediction methods are consistent. And so steps 1 through 6 aren't typically relevant to characterizing display performance of traditional 2D displays. And because an XR environment can be unique depending on the hardware or software used, the display performance of the head-mounted display can be, it can be unpredictable. So it's important to keep in mind the potential causes that are contributing to compromised image quality. So now I'm going to go through the effects and causes of 4 distinct XR spatial temporal characterization characteristics that I characterized, and that's motion blur, spatial temporal sampling, flicker, and judder. So I'm gonna go over these pretty quickly. The effects of motion blur include loss of spatial resolution in images when the data is moving or when the user is moving within the scene. So this can be caused by a low refresh rate of any of the systems 2 to 7. Oops, I forgot to show that, sorry. So any of the systems 2 to 7, which ultimately results in motion to photon latency, and the asynchrony between the systems 1 and 10, that is also going to cause motion blur. So it's gonna look like that. And sampling effects include decreased spatial resolution in some frames. And these effects are caused by surging input events that exceed processing capability of the XR application. So if you look on, if you compare the two images, you've probably run into this sampling error before, or this aliasing, as you all know. But more specifically, if you look at from 5B to 6, the step on the right, that's spatial downsampling, which is caused by compression of the medical data. And so that's kind of what was happening in that the color rendering in the Unity TG18 test pattern I was showing before. Whereas temporal undersampling can be caused by transient user movement between display updates. So that's between 5A to 6. So yeah, that could be due to, like, you know, the real time of the rendering pipeline not keeping up, or maybe you just have some buffering, who knows. So on top of that, you can also have pixel remapping onto the display itself, and that's from system 6 to 7. And all of these things can affect sampling. Okay, and flicker can be characterized by luminance fluctuations in the rendering of subsequent frames. So you have, you know, as you're moving across the frame or as a video is playing, you see certain pixels that look like they're flickering even though they shouldn't. And that's because the luminance isn't consistent. And this can be caused by low resolution rendering of system 6 or of user or object movement, or by the pixelization errors of system 7. All right, lastly, judder can be characterized by unwanted discontinuities in the visualization. So it's gonna look unsmooth. It's gonna look like unsmooth motion rendering. So if you're in a headset and you're moving really, really fast back and forth, it's, you know, you can see this judder effect where it looks like it's jumpy. And so that, like motion blur, judder can be caused by slow or uneven update of any of the systems 2 to 7. And in some cases, frames are noticeably dropped, which isn't good. On the other hand, judder can still occur at very high frame rates during head movement, because, you know, your eyes can move up to your head and your eyes can move up to 300 degrees per second, and the human visual system is able to perceive a stable image throughout that movement, thanks to the muscles on the side of your eyes that counters the movement of your head. So when you're in a headset, actually your headset actively destabilizes that view. Yeah, so, all right, so this work, it's titled Spatial Temporal Characteristics of Medical Extended Reality Systems, by myself and, again, my mentors, Wei Chung, Ryan, and Aldo. This was recently accepted this past month to the SPIE Medical Imaging 2021 conference, where I'll be giving the talk in February 2021, and the proceedings manuscript should be available around then. So in the interest of time, I was only able to cover 3 of our studies today, but these are all of the current and ongoing research at the FDA in medical extended reality, which is a lot to cram in one poster, but I tried my best. I know it's like information overload, but like, what do I do when they ask me to cram 11 studies into one poster, right? Okay. In summary, there's a wide variety of platforms that are constantly changing, and sponsors are often using these off-the-shelf consumer-grade headsets, which are meant for gaming and not necessarily for medicine. And so there's this lack of characterization methods and consensus on how do you evaluate these as medical devices. There's a huge gap there. So in our efforts, we've characterized optical aberration, transverse chromatic aberration, and we've also characterized changes to color rendering properties associated with different rendering settings for a digital test object. And we also highlighted the various texture import settings and how that can affect color. And then finally, we characterize causes and effects of 4 distinct XR spatial temporal characterized effects or artifacts, people call them, that, and all of these things affect image quality and the interpretation of medical data. So it's important to keep in mind if you decide to, jump into XR medical visualizations, you really want to ask yourself why XR, because there's a lot of limitations in technology at the moment. So you really want to understand what sorts of image quality compromises you might be making when you make the jump to XR. Okay, so that was my talk. I think I went over, so I'm going to stop now. Thank you very much. Go ahead and stop sharing.
Hi, Andrea.
Hey.
Thank you so much. That was super comprehensive, and it was very, very, very cool to learn about all the different components. We have some questions popping up, so I'll just get started. So we have a question from Danny. What would you say these findings on image quality and distortion infer for the context in which XR is applied medical training and education? Does this suggest that the benefits of using XR training might in some cases be outweighed by the limitations on image quality?
Yeah, so that's an excellent question, and one thing I really want to point out is I'm coming in with my FDA hat, right? And so from this mindset, we are more concerned about things going, I guess, into a human body. So if there's a surgical use or maybe even a diagnostic use, that's something that we really care about, the image quality. But if it's for training and education, I mean, like lecture slides aren't going to need FDA approval. This is more of a regulatory research background. So when it comes to training and education, you don't really need regulation for XR in that specific indication for use. So these findings on image quality and distortion, they're important, of course, and they're important to keep in mind. But if you're sticking with just the education and training, it's kind of like, if you remember the risk categories, it's a lot less of a risk. So that, having the best image quality might not be your priority in that sense.
Okay, thank you. We have another question for Ahmed. He says, thanks for the amazing presentation, really interesting. Have you included the Oculus Quest 2 in your studies, as it has higher resolution and increased frame rate of 90?
So that's a great question, because that's kind of what I'm doing right now. I just bought these really expensive fast cameras where I'm capturing 1,000 images per second. And so essentially, I'm trying to catch everything that's happening during the frames and in between the frames, So that's next up on the list. We're going to look at the Oculus Quest 2 as well as all of the other new headsets coming out. Yes.
Okay, thank you. And we have one question from Sarah. I'm wondering about whether research is also done with consideration of users with disabilities, and if so, how does that work or look like?
Yeah, so that's more on the human factor side of things. And so that's actually not my area of expertise at the moment, even though it's really interesting and I think it's really important. And unfortunately with COVID, it's been really hard to, justify human user testing at the moment. So I'm not sure how much progress we're going to make this year with that. But yes, there are a lot of considerations that we are with disabilities, for instance, color blindness or hearing, or maybe just having one sight. Yeah, these are all very important things, but we're it's gonna be a while before we can address all of that.
Yeah, for sure. We have one question from Kara. Thank you for sharing your really fascinating research. Can you talk more about the factors that contribute to the feeling of nausea when using AR/VR applications? For instance, is it understood if or how TCA can lead to the feeling of feeling sick?
Yeah, so there's a ton of research on nausea and XR, and I guess I wouldn't be the best person since I haven't studied it myself, but I do know a few interesting stories or a few interesting topics that are popular currently in the field that contribute to nausea. And of course, there's the latency. That's the biggest one. If there's any sort of latency where what you're seeing and what your brain is perceiving as your body moving, if these aren't lining up, there's discomfort in the user. And there's also a lot of visual discomfort that are more passive and you don't realize they're happening maybe until you're using it for an extended period of time. But for instance, there's something, for instance, like the vergence accommodation conflict. So this is relevant in both AR and VR, but it's more obvious in augmented reality. So if you've tried like a HoloLens or any augmented reality, it's a see-through head-mounted display, so you can see the real world around you. But all of the virtual elements that's being projected are at a fixed depth in front of your eyes, and your eyes are rotating to focus on different objects. So there are different planes of focus that should be happening, but because you have a fixed lens in front of your eyes are rotating inwards to focus on that plane, but this virtual object is telling you that, or the image is telling you that the object is actually 2 meters away. So this kind of causes discomfort for the user's eyes, and also, it just it's a whole mess.
Yeah, it's really fascinating thinking about, not just technology limitations and that sort of thing, but also like how our biology actually perceiving things. So right. That's really cool. So I know we're running a little, we're cutting into lunch a little bit, and I just want to wrap it up with like one last question. But what are your sort of future focus in terms of like your research and your work?
Yeah, so that third research I presented about spatial temporal, that is actually such a large topic. I feel like if I want to address all the things I see wrong with that, it'll probably take me like a decade to address all of it. Yeah. So I'm definitely going to be doing a lot of spatial temporal things in the near future, and that's essentially just what's happening as things are moving. Because the user is moving, their head is moving, objects are moving within the scene, and then you also have like really cool technology happening. NVIDIA's GPUs are so powerful now. We can have like real-time ray tracing and start to look at volume data in VR instead of just mesh. I think that would be a very relevant research topic, especially with medical data. People are kind of going towards doing a volume visualization instead of like having to segment out a mesh and then doing that, just going straight from data to visualization without having a segment. So once that happens, which I know it's going to happen, there's going to be a lot more questions with this spatial temporal research that's going to come about. So for the time being, I see myself there.
Okay, thank you so much. That was really, really cool. Yeah, it's exciting. All the things that are happening, even if there are challenges, it's still really exciting to pursue. Thank you so much for joining.